The 5:47 p.m. train slid into Victoria Station like a shadow reluctant to arrive. The rain had turned to mist now, clinging to the platform like memory, and the gaslights above cast trembling halos that danced on the soot-covered carriages of the Northern Night Express. I stood still, collar raised, coat soaked at the cuffs, and somewhere in that drifting hush, I saw him, Monsieur Hercule Poirot, standing near the final coach, his gray eyes lost in thought, his signature mustache untouched by the weather's mood. Without speaking, he extended his gloved hand and passed me a folded card, edges crisp, as if untouched by human fingers. I read it quickly. She travels with truth bound in silence. A locket lost, a name forgotten. Watch the hour before midnight, Hastings. It will not lie. Before I could ask a single question, the whistle blew, and we stepped aboard. Inside, the warmth of the train was deceiving. Even the velvet walls of the compartment seemed to hush their own color, as if afraid to speak too boldly. The other passengers were already seated, their faces half lit in lamplight, half swallowed by gloom. I saw them in brief glances. A stern elderly woman with a powdered shawl and unreadable eyes, a young man folding and refolding a telegram with twitching fingers, a well-dressed gentleman whose aristocratic calm was betrayed only by his incessant tapping against his teacup, and a foreign professor with a leather case of odd-smelling herbs and trembling hands. They sat in silence, eyes down, lips tight, the sort of quiet that doesn't come from fatigue, but from tension you can't quite name yet. She boarded just before departure, Miss Margaret Hartwell, a woman in her late 20s perhaps, her posture frail but composed, her eyes large, heavy, and distant. She wore a plain traveling coat, no makeup, no fanfare. Only a single object stood out, a fine chain disappearing beneath her collar. Something about her presence, too quiet, too measured, caught Poirot's attention immediately. He watched her not as a man admiring beauty, but as a surgeon listens to the beat of an irregular heart. That first hour passed in uneasy quiet. The train swayed northward, rain tapping rhythmically against the windows like nervous fingers. Just past Watford, Miss Hartwell slipped away from the lounge car, her tea left untouched. She didn't return. Later, a porter discovered her in carriage 8, slumped in her seat, eyes closed as if resting. But Poirot knew instantly. The stillness was too perfect, the body too deliberate. When I touched her wrist, it was cold. Not the cold of weather, but the unmistakable chill of life, having gone out silently. There was no wound, no mark, only the faint scent of lavender and something sharper, metallic, nearly medicinal, hanging faintly in the air. Poirot stepped forward, calm, focused. He lifted the edge of her collar carefully. Sewn discreetly into the lining was a tiny device, almost imperceptible, a needle-like projection no bigger than a button clasp. His voice, when he spoke, was very quiet. So small, so silent, yet so final. Mon ami, this was no accident. This was murder, and very carefully planned. The train didn't stop. The night rolled on, and with it, the mystery deepened. Somewhere between London and Manchester, someone on this train had ended the life of Miss Margaret Hartwell, a woman who, as Poirot would later declare, carried the truth not only in her hands, but in her blood. And someone else had wanted that truth buried forever. The carriage groaned as it rocked over the tracks. Outside, the mist clung like a veil. Inside, silence reigned. But behind that silence, secrets waited, ancient, buried, and dangerous. And before this night ended, they would all be unearthed. The hours that followed Miss Hartwell's death passed not with panic, but with something quieter, a collective unease, the sort that shrouds a place before lightning strikes. Poirot requested that the train not be stopped. "The killer, mon ami," he whispered to me. "He does not wish to be found in motion. Let us remain in the theater of his crime." By the time Inspector Bradley arrived aboard at Crewe, summoned discreetly from a nearby junction, the passengers had gathered in the dining car under low, flickering lights. They sat in forced silence, waiting to be spoken to but afraid to speak. Poirot stood, his manner calm but grave, and addressed them all in that lilting accent that was both charming and relentless. "Mesdames et messieurs, a great tragedy has occurred. A young woman is dead, Miss Margaret Hartwell. But this was not a death from nature. It was, I fear, murder. A collective intake of breath followed, and for a moment, every eye turned to the window, as though the moors rushing past might hold some safer truth. Lord Pembroke, regal and impassive, stiffened. His eyes shifted quickly to the German professor, Linderman, who in turn fumbled with his spectacles. Miss Agatha Winters, the retired headmistress, crossed her arms tightly, her gaze unreadable, and young Timothy Ashford, barely 20, swallowed hard and looked down at the folded telegram he refused to part with. Poirot didn't move as he spoke again. This young woman traveled under a name, Miss Lee, but among her belongings, we found documents that tell another tale. A birth certificate for a child named Margaret Elizabeth Hartwell, born in Surrey, 1915. The parents listed, Colonel James Hartwell and Lady Catherine Hartwell. Names of influence, yes? Nobility. A sharp stillness followed his words, as though something ancient had been disturbed. I opened the leather portfolio found with her. Among the papers were yellowed newspaper clippings, a photograph of a child beside a uniformed man, and, most chilling, a locket silver, etched with a mockingbird, and inside it, a tiny inscription. To my little birdie, may you always sing of hope, mother, 1918. I passed the locket to Poirot. He examined it beneath a magnifying glass. Mon Dieu, he murmured. So much grief sealed in such a little thing. Miss Winters spoke for the first time, her tone sharp. Hartwell, the family that lost their daughter in the Zeppelin raid? They said she vanished during the bombing, never found. It was all over society papers. Yes, said Poirot, still studying the locket. She was 3 years old. And now, 20 years later, she returns, quietly, under a false name. And before she reaches her destination, she dies. Professor Linderman cleared his throat nervously. Surely you don't believe this is connected to some ancient family scandal? Perhaps the girl simply... None. Poirot interrupted softly. Miss Hartwell did not die for who she was, but for what she carried. This, he held up the locket, was not mere sentiment. It was a key to truths long buried. Bradley stepped forward now, tone curt. We'll need to question everyone, backgrounds, movements, connections to the war years. Poirot nodded but raised a finger. We must tread carefully. The killer is among us, and he or she may be watching now to see how close we are to the truth. At that moment, I caught a movement across the aisle. Timothy Ashford crumpling his telegram tighter in his fist, his jaw clenched, sweat dotting his temple. He looked over at Poirot with something bordering on fear. Later, when I cornered him alone in the corridor and asked if he had known Miss Hartwell, he hesitated for just a breath too long. She said she could help me, he whispered, that I might not be who I thought I was. I told Poirot. He didn't seem surprised. Hastings, he said, this case, it is not only about murder. It is about identity, taken, broken, and perhaps stolen. He turned back toward the locket and touched its edge gently. She died carrying the truth, mon ami. Now we must carry it for her. Outside, the moors rolled by, wild and gray. Inside, something colder still was rising. The truth, perhaps. Or something worse. That night, as the train curved northward through an ocean of mist and moorland, silence cloaked the corridors like a velvet curtain. But it was not a restful silence. It was expectant, taut, and listening. The kind that seems to hold its breath. Poirot and I returned to our compartment, but he did not sit. He paced, slowly, methodically, as though walking a labyrinth of thought. The locket lay open upon the small table between us, its mockingbird gleaming under the gaslight, and beside it, a sheaf of fragile documents Miss Hartwell had secreted in her luggage. Names, addresses, sums, dates, all leading back to one era, the war years, and all tied somehow to adoption agencies, unofficial orphanage clearances, and what Poirot described, in the softest whisper, as a map of theft done in silence. Just before midnight, a knock interrupted our thoughts. A steward had discovered something. He led us down the narrow passageway to carriage 8, the same where Miss Hartwell had been found. On the floor outside her compartment, near the doorframe, was a single object, a torn velvet pouch. Inside it, nothing, but its fabric bore two things: a faint scent of dried herbs, and a single crimson petal, barely hanging to its threads. Poirot knelt, touching the petal with great delicacy. "Belladonna," he murmured. "Deadly nightshade. Beautiful. Lethal." I looked at him in disbelief. "Do you think this was what killed her?" He shook his head. "Nah, mon ami. Too crude. But this tells us someone with knowledge, was here. And they brought more than grief with them." We returned to the lounge, where Professor Linderman sat quietly, sipping his tea with visible unease. Poirot took a seat across from him, and his voice was almost conversational. "Tell me, Professor, how do you dry and preserve the belladonna petals without losing their structure?" The man's teacup halted in midair. I beg your pardon," he stammered. Poirot smiled gently. "The scent remains even after time, yes? Only those who work closely with such flora would recognize the residual oils. You, Professor, have spent decades with herbs. So tell me, were you in Miss Hartwell's compartment last night?" "I most certainly was not," he said, color draining from his face. Poirot leaned back, steepling his fingers. "And yet, the pouch was stitched in the Bavarian style, used to carry press samples. You know this design, do you not?" Linderman glanced away, and for a moment, silence fell again, heavy and suspicious. It was then that a second voice broke in. Miss Agatha Winters entered from the corridor, hands folded over her handbag, her expression unreadable. "This is absurd," she said crisply. "We're leaping from flowers to murders. The poor girl died of natural causes, surely. She looked ill to begin with." Poirot turned slowly. "Natural causes rarely carry needle marks hidden in coat collars, madam, and rarely do they leave behind documents damning enough to unmake entire families." Miss Winters' lips pressed into a thin line. "Then perhaps it is not the killer we should be hunting, but the reason someone would want to silence her. That, Monsieur Poirot, would be the greater crime." Her tone was clipped, but Poirot's gaze did not waver. "Oui," he said softly, "and you would know this, madam, because you were once headmistress of the Alverley School for Displaced Youths, were you not?" The room fell utterly still. "How did you—" she began, her voice faltering. "I am Hercule Poirot," he said simply. "I notice things, especially when names appear in both school registers and on the documents Miss Hartwell carried." Miss Winters stood straighter now. What she had were ghosts. Old names, old files, half-truths at best. "And yet," Poirot murmured, "they were enough to frighten someone into killing." At that moment, young Timothy Ashford entered quietly. He looked pale, haunted, the telegram still in his hand. "She promised me answers," he said in a voice too steady to belong to a boy. "She said my real family, that they were still alive. She said I had the right to know." Poirot turned slowly. "And you do, mon garçon. But the truth, it carries weight. And those who tried to keep it hidden, they feared it more than death itself." The train groaned along its rails. Outside, the fog pressed tighter to the windows. Inside, we sat surrounded by passengers with poised expressions and concealed pasts. And somewhere among them was someone who had watched Margaret Hartwell die, and felt relief, not remorse. And yet Poirot leaned forward now, eyes sharper than ever. "It is close, Hastings," he whispered to me. "The answer, it is near. And before the train reaches its destination, it will rise, like the dawn through mist." The sky beyond the windows had grown darker, not merely with night, but with the kind of overcast weight that warned of storms. As the train continued northward, the rhythm of the wheels felt more urgent, like a heartbeat. Inside the lounge, tension curled in the corners. The passengers no longer made polite conversation. They watched. They listened. They wondered which face among them masked a murderer. Inspector Bradley had begun his formal questioning. He worked methodically, like a man sorting receipts, but it was clear to all that Poirot, not the inspector, held the invisible thread running through the tangled mystery. By late afternoon, the baggage car had been locked under guard. Bradley discovered that several cases had been disturbed. One porter knocked unconscious, and a satchel of papers stolen. Papers we could only assume had once belonged to Margaret Hartwell. Poirot's face grew grave upon hearing this. "Desperation, mon ami," he murmured to me. "The killer is frightened, and frightened people make mistakes." It was not long before a mistake was found. Inside a compartment near the rear of the train, one of the constables unearthed a small wooden box tucked deep beneath a berth, wedged behind an emergency toolkit. Its contents were minimal, but damning. A stained envelope addressed to Margaret Hartwell, torn open hastily. A handkerchief monogrammed A.W., Agatha Winter's initials, and worst of all, a duplicate key to Miss Hartwell's luggage case. The room grew quiet as Poirot examined the box. Miss Winters, summoned before us, stared at it but showed no panic, only a slow, cold realization that the veil of suspicion had slipped. "That key," she said, "was not mine." "None." Poirot lifted it. "Then how do you explain your monogram in the same box? And your prior role at Alverley School? You admit you oversaw records, yes?" "I did," she said tightly, her hands clasped before her like folded wings. "But that does not make me a killer." "No," Poirot said. "It makes you a gatekeeper, one who may have held secrets others would do anything to keep buried." All eyes turned as Professor Linderman entered next. Poirot asked only a single question. "Professor, would you kindly explain why you were seen with a velvet pouch containing belladonna residue?" Linderman swallowed hard. It was part of a preserved botanical sample. "For my studies." Poirot raised an eyebrow, then explained why it was found at the door to Miss Hartwell's compartment, torn and empty. I must have dropped it. I never entered her room. I swear it." Timothy Ashford, watching from the corridor, looked toward Poirot. "Why does everyone keep lying?" he asked quietly. "Because," Poirot said, "the truth is too dangerous to speak aloud." He turned back to the passengers gathered. "Listen carefully, MES Amos. Miss Hartwell did not simply stumble upon a few mismatched records. She was tracing something far older, more deliberate. During the chaos of the war, when families were scattered and children vanished without a trace, there was a network, not of charity, but of calculated, quiet theft. Wealthy families who had lost children, and those willing to sell them replacements. That is what she uncovered. The revelation fell like thunder. Even the air in the carriage seemed to tighten. Miss Winters shifted, her fingers clasping so tightly the skin blanched. Lord Pembroke looked away, jaw clenched. Linderman stared into nothingness. She had documents, names, transactions, identities rewritten. Poirot continued. "And someone profited from that arrangement. They feared exposure, so they did what frightened criminals always do." He touched the silver locket again. "They silenced her." "But who?" I asked. Poirot looked at me. "We are close. Very close. The killer fears the truth will emerge before London. That fear will soon become action." As if on cue, the train gave a sharp jolt. Steam hissed outside the windows. The lights flickered once. Then silence. Poirot rose slowly. "Hastings, gather everyone. Lock the carriages." The mockingbird's voice was silenced once, but tonight we shall hear it sing. The storm finally broke over the moors as the train barreled forward, wind shrieking like a warning through the cracks in the window panes. Inside the lounge car, Poirot stood calmly amid the rising storm of unease. Passengers had been summoned, seats arranged like pews in a dim chapel, and silence reigned except for the rhythmic hum of steel wheels beneath our feet. The air had changed, less of polite uncertainty, more of dread. The truth had begun to surface, and someone among us was slipping under its weight. Miss Winters sat at the far end, her posture rigid, expression unreadable. Lord Pembroke, lips tight, avoided every eye in the room. Professor Linderman stood by the rain-speckled window, his shoulders hunched as if weighed down by something more than guilt. Timothy Ashford sat closest to Poirot, hands in his lap, telegram crushed between pale fingers. I stood behind them all, heart thudding with the growing certainty that what we were about to hear would break more than reputations. It might shatter lives. Poirot stepped forward, his voice, low but clear, cut through the thunder rumbling outside. "It is time, MES Amos, for truth, but not the kind one finds in ledgers and records. No, this is truth buried in hearts, wrapped in grief, and finally revealed. He turned to Timothy first. "Young man, tell us what Miss Hartwell promised you." Timothy looked up slowly. "She said she could help me find where I really came from, that the records from the war, they were wrong, that I wasn't who I'd always believed I was." Poirot nodded gently. "And she told you why?" "Because," Timothy whispered, "she was like me, one of the stolen children." Gasps rippled through the room. Lord Pembroke shifted in his seat, color draining from his cheeks. Miss Winters crossed her legs with deliberate poise. Poirot continued. "Miss Hartwell was taken from her family during a Zeppelin raid, rescued, then sold. She grew up believing in one name, only to discover a truth that unraveled everything. She began tracing others like her. Dozens, if not hundreds. All sold to wealthy, grieving families. Children of war, commodified by those who saw opportunity in chaos. And someone here," I added softly, "didn't want those names made public." Poirot nodded once. "We. Someone with everything to lose. Someone who built their very life on the silence of others." He turned to Professor Linderman. "Professor, your knowledge of toxins, of belladonna and cardiac poisons, has drawn suspicion. But I do not believe you murdered Margaret Hartwell." Linderman's head snapped up in shock. "You possess the means, but not the motive. Your guilt lies in your past, your research, your complicity in certain wartime medical programs. But you did not kill her. Your shame is real, but it is not criminal." Linderman bowed his head, eyes glistening. Poirot shifted his gaze. "Lord Pembroke, you feared Margaret's investigation would reveal you were not of noble blood, that your lineage was purchased. You confronted her, yes. You even begged her to stay silent. But you did not poison her. The fear on your face when you learned who she was, that was not the fear of guilt. It was the fear of exposure." Lord Pembroke lowered his eyes, breathing ragged. Then Poirot turned, slowly, unforgivingly, to Miss Agatha Winters. The poison was administered via a hidden collar device, a technique requiring proximity, intimacy. Someone who could gain access to Miss Hartwell's belongings without raising suspicion. He stepped closer. "You served as a headmistress during the war. You had access to records, to abandoned children. You arranged adoptions, didn't you, madam?" Her reply came cold, sharp. "I gave them homes, futures. The war made orphans of them all. I only ensured they were not forgotten." "No," Poirot said gently. "You ensured they were sold. For a price. And when Miss Hartwell began to reveal the extent of your scheme, one that profited you for 2 decades, you silenced her. You entered her compartment under the guise of kindness. You placed the collar around her neck, and you waited. Her silence was deafening. Then her voice, calm and chilling. She would have ruined everything. Dozens of families. Hundreds of lives. Justice," Poirot said softly, "is not yours to weigh against reputation." The storm outside shrieked. Inside, Miss Winters sat, spine straight, lips thin with bitter resolve. "You are clever, Mr. Poirot," she said at last. "But the world does not run on justice. It runs on preservation." Poirot turned away, the faintest sigh escaping his lips. "And preservation, madam, becomes cruelty when built upon lies." He looked to Inspector Bradley. "You may proceed." Bradley stepped forward, handcuffs at the ready. And just like that, the mockingbird's silence ended. Miss Hartwell's voice, long quieted by fear and death, had found its echo, and it spoke. The rain had begun to ease, its rhythm now a soft patter against the windows as the storm gave way to a bleak gray hush. Inside the train, no one spoke. The arrest of Miss Winters had cast a shadow longer than the corridor we now stood in. I followed Poirot through the dim hallway as Inspector Bradley escorted the once formidable headmistress away in silence, her composure cracked, but not broken. The dignity she once wore like iron armor had crumbled into something brittle and cold. In the dining car, the atmosphere was brittle with realization. Lord Pembroke sat with his head in his hands, no longer the commanding aristocrat, but a man unraveling beneath the truth. Timothy Ashford leaned into the window, eyes unfocused, watching his own reflection in the dark. And Professor Linderman, who had stood so tall in intellectual pride, now seemed a ghost of himself, his past returning to judge him in silence. Poirot remained still for a moment, as if absorbing the weight of it all. "Do you feel it, Hastings?" he said softly. "The quiet? No, mon ami. The shift. The burden that comes when truth is no longer a theory, but a presence in the room. Truth has a gravity of its own." He turned and faced the remaining passengers. "We have uncovered the perpetrator, yes. But the crime? Ah, the crime continues to ripple." Timothy stirred. "What happens now?" His voice cracked like glass under pressure. Poirot walked to him slowly, deliberately. "You have spent your life believing in a name, a lineage, a history carefully crafted by those who meant well, perhaps, but who built it upon falsehood." Timothy's eyes burned. "So what am I now, if not the child they raised?" "You are still the child they loved," Poirot said gently. "But now you must choose whether to chase what was lost or honor what was real." "But I don't know who I am," the boy whispered. "Then, mon garçon, you begin again, not with lies, but with choice." Lord Pembroke looked up then. His eyes were red. "I knew deep down, I always knew. My father used to pause whenever I asked about the early years. My mother cried when I asked too much. They were kind people, but they never told me the truth." Poirot nodded. "Sometimes silence is chosen out of love, but it is still silence." He paced once more. Miss Hartwell did not wish to punish the innocent. She wished to give names back to those who had none, to unmask the buried and the forgotten. Her death was not vengeance. It was the price she paid for disturbing the comfortable illusion others had come to depend upon. I found myself gripping the back of a chair, breath caught in my throat. These weren't just crimes. They were absences, lives unlived, histories unraveled by greed, stitched together again for convenience. Professor Linderman spoke up suddenly, voice raw. "If I had spoken out after the war, perhaps none of this." Poirot raised a hand. "You are not the only one who stayed silent, Professor, and you will not be the last. But remember this, every silence delays justice. Every delay deepens the wound." Outside, the train began to slow, the lights of the next station flickering through the mist. Victoria Station. London loomed ahead, not as a beacon of hope, but as a reckoning. Poirot turned to the group one final time. "Tonight, many of you will walk off this train changed. Some burdened with truth, some released by it. All of you reborn, in one way or another." He looked at me. "And Hastings, you see now why justice cannot always be wrapped in verdicts and punishments. Sometimes it is only found in the naming, in the unearthing, in the light." As the train hissed into stillness and the station embraced us, I felt the echo of Miss Hartwell's song lingering still, faint but resolute, like a melody half remembered, a name half spoken, waiting to be known. Victoria Station, with all its noise and bustling grandeur, did little to soften the gravity that clung to us as we descended onto the platform. And yet, even here, among the shouting porters and hissing engines, the weight of the last 24 hours pressed down like a mourning shroud. Poirot remained close to the carriage, his gloved hands folded, his eyes not on the city, but on the people now disembarking. For him, the case was not over. A murder had been solved, yes, but the story beneath that murder was still unraveling. We gathered once more in the station's waiting salon, ourselves, Lord Pembroke, young Timothy, Professor Linderman, and Inspector Bradley. Each of us changed in the quiet but irreversible way that comes only when the truth has stripped bare the illusions we thought were life itself. Poirot stood at the center, calm as ever, but with a fire behind his eyes that I had come to recognize as the herald of revelation. "I have asked you here not to reopen the case," he began, "but to reveal the final layer, one you have all sensed, but not yet named." He turned first to Lord Pembroke. "You believed you were a victim, and in many ways, Monseigneur, you were. But the tragedy lies not in your ignorance, but in the power that ignorance allowed you to wield. A title inherited, a fortune assumed. And now you must reckon with the price of that lie." Pembroke's jaw clenched. "You mean to strip me of it all?" Poirot's voice was calm. "No, my lord, that is not my place. But the question is not what I would do. The question is, can you wear the crown of a name built on a theft without shame? The peer looked down at his gloved hands. For once, he had no retort. Poirot moved next to Timothy, who sat pale and hunched at the far edge of the room. And you, jeune homme, have lost the only identity you have ever known. But Miss Hartwell did not die in vain. The documents she carried, the records recovered from Miss Winters's secret ledger, hold clues. Names, places, enough to begin a search. But what if I find nothing? Timothy asked, eyes wide. What if no one wants me? Poirot knelt before him, voice like silk. Then you will build your own name, young Ashford. A name not taken, but chosen. That is the greatest gift any man can possess. Timothy nodded once, and in that nod was a resolve I had not seen in him before. It was then that Professor Linderman spoke, voice tinged with guilt. I read some of the names in the recovered file. One of them, a girl taken from Baden-Württemberg during the early years. Her parents were colleagues of mine. I never knew what happened to her. I assumed. I never imagined. Poirot gave him a long, sad look. Many assumed, Professor, that is how such evils survive, not through hatred, but through omission, through comfort. Inspector Bradley stepped forward now. What do we do with these files, Poirot? The Yard won't touch them without official cause. Poirot gave a slow smile. Then we begin quietly. Through the right barristers, the right papers. We reunite those who can still be found. We give names back to the nameless. The station bell rang, echoing faintly in the distance. Poirot moved to the tall windows, watching the light grow dim beyond the glass. Miss Hartwell wished to leave no one behind. Not in death, not in truth. He turned back to us, the lamplight casting his face into half-shadow. She was the mockingbird, yes, singing into the storm. And now it is up to us to ensure her song echoes in those who remain. A heavy silence fell. I looked around the room then, and for the first time I realized something profound. Each of these people, broken, shaken, grieving, had in their own way been actors in a tragedy not of their choosing. And yet, by standing here, they had become part of something else as well, a reckoning. Poirot stepped toward me, the faintest smile tugging at his lips. Come, Hastings. We have done what we could, but now begins the part that is harder still, living with the truth. We walked out into the London dusk, where the gaslights flickered and the city swallowed us in its eternal, restless rhythm. The amber haze of evening had begun to settle over London by the time we returned to our modest rooms near Baker Street. The carriage ride from Victoria Station was unusually silent, no idle chatter from me, no amused rebukes from Poirot. The city's heartbeat pulsed faintly outside, its lamps flickering one by one like sentinels in mourning. I knew Poirot's mind had not left the train. Not truly. The murder may have been solved, the villain named and removed, but a deeper shadow lingered. One not so easily arrested. He sat near the fire, arms folded, his eyes fixed on the dancing flame. For a time, neither of us spoke. And then, with quiet weight, Poirot said, There are crimes, mon ami, that wear the cloak of logic but leave behind only sorrow. I knew exactly what he meant. The next morning brought headlines, brief, evasive, careful. Woman arrested in train death. No mention of adoption scandals, no hint of stolen children or shattered lives. Miss Winters had powerful connections still, and Inspector Bradley, ever cautious of the political tide, had quietly arranged for the deeper truth to remain buried. For now. But Poirot was not finished. By midday, he had secured a private appointment with a solicitor known for handling discreet inquiries into wartime misplacements. In his pocket were the recovered fragments of Miss Hartwell's locket, its hinge still sticky from the missing photographs, and its chain tangled with faint traces of pressed wax. In his briefcase, he carried pages from Miss Winters's secret ledger, entries coded with initials, dates, and destinations. This, Poirot said as we walked through the fog-laced streets toward Lincoln's Inn, is where justice begins, not with a cell door, but with a name given back to someone who lost it. Over the days that followed, the work unfolded like stitching a torn quilt, old records reassembled, Churches contacted, embassies whispered to. Poirot, with infinite patience, matched fragments to truth. Some families were found. Some had perished. Some had chosen, upon hearing the truth, to return to silence. But not all. Weeks later, a young woman with trembling hands arrived from Sussex. She carried with her a letter, yellowed with age, addressed from a nurse once employed by the Hartwells. The signature was unmistakable. And so, the first thread led home. Timothy Ashford was reunited with a cousin, his mother's sister, who'd believed him dead these past 20 years. Lord Pembroke, shaken but not shattered, stepped forward to fund a small trust that would assist other adoptees in discovering their pasts. Whether he did it from guilt or grace, I do not know, but the gesture mattered. As for Professor Linderman, he returned quietly to Germany. In his parting letter to Poirot, he wrote only, "Thank you for not confusing cowardice with malice. I will do better." Poirot said nothing in reply, but he read the letter twice, and then placed it gently into the fire. I remember the last time I saw Miss Hartwell's name. It was inscribed not in a newspaper, not in a courtroom transcript, but on a plaque outside a modest building in London's East End, a genealogical archive now housing the restored files of the lost and the unnamed. Above the entrance, the brass plate read, "The Margaret Hartwell Foundation for Truth, Identity, and Memory." Poirot stood before it, hat in hand. "She sang Hastings," he whispered, "and now others may sing because of her." And I, for all my blunders, for all my insistence on simpler views of right and wrong, understood then that truth, real, deep, lasting truth, is rarely loud. It does not come wrapped in gavel knocks or jail bars. It comes softly, in a letter delivered, in a name remembered, in a life mended. And as the wind rustled the plaque's corners and dusk fell over London once more, I knew the case of the Mockingbird had ended, not with vengeance, but with a reckoning that would never truly fade. The sky above London had turned to iron by the time news reached us from Scotland Yard. Agatha Winters, once the sharp-tongued guardian of appearances, now sat alone in a high-walled holding cell. The papers avoided the scandal's full depth. No mention of forged adoptions. No whisper of children sold under false names. Just a few measured lines about a woman, linked to suspicious activity aboard a train. But Poirot, as ever, was less concerned with what the world said, more with what the truth demanded. By mid-morning, we were once again summoned, this time not to the grand drawing rooms of aristocrats or the polished carriages of the elite, but to a quiet judicial chamber in Holborn. Inside, Agatha Winters waited, her hair now pulled tightly back, her eyes hollow but alert. She looked older than before, as though the weight of all her decisions had finally settled on her shoulders. Poirot approached without judgment, only that peculiar, unshakable stillness he wore in moments of gravity. "Madam," he said gently, "you understand why we have come." She gave a short nod. "You've brought more names, haven't you?" "More of them," she murmured, her voice brittle. "You will dig them all up now." "I will not," Poirot replied, "but they will come forward themselves. Some already have. They seek no retribution, only a return to truth." Miss Winters looked away, her jaw trembling. "They don't understand what the world was like then, after the war. Everything broken. So much grief, so many empty homes. I only gave them what they wanted." "You gave them a lie," Poirot said, not cruelly, but with unmistakable certainty. "You built lives upon other people's losses. You played God, and then buried the evidence." Her fingers clenched the edge of the table. "And yet I gave them love. Isn't that what matters in the end?" Poirot's eyes narrowed, not in anger, but in sorrow. "It matters, yes, but not more than truth, not more than choice. You robbed families of the chance to grieve, and you robbed the children of their right to know who they were." For a long time, no one spoke. Then Miss Winters asked, almost as a whisper, "Do they hate me?" Poirot shook his head slowly. "Some do, but many, they do not know what to feel. And so they grieve again, this time not for a parent, but for a life they never knew they had." That afternoon, she signed a full confession. It did not come with a dramatic courtroom scene. No shouts, no slamming gavels, Just an old woman placing pen to paper, her hand shaking as she spelled out the names, the dates, the payments, secrets she had guarded for decades now laid bare in black ink. From there, it moved quickly. Scotland Yard launched a discreet inquiry into the files Poirot had uncovered. A new division formed, one tasked with handling wartime adoption cases. Poirot himself declined any formal credit. "I am no crusader," he told them. "I am only the custodian of truth." But I knew better. He had taken a tragedy, one woven through years of silence, and turned it into a pathway home for dozens. Some cases led to joyful reunions. Others ended in quiet letters left at gravestones. But each one, however small, carried the echo of Miss Hartwell's mission. The locket was never recovered. Miss Winters claimed she destroyed it in the dining car just after administering the poison. But Poirot believed otherwise. "No," he said once, as we passed Victoria Station where it all began. "It was not destroyed. It was hidden, perhaps by Miss Hartwell herself." "Why?" I asked. "Because, mon ami," Poirot said with a faint smile, "some truths are not ready to be heard, not until the world is ready to listen." And with that, he stepped into the evening mist, his silhouette sharp, his step certain. Miss Hartwell's name would never appear in the histories, but her song, quiet, mournful, resilient, had been sung at last, and the mockingbird, though fallen, had not been silenced. Not truly. London was quiet that evening, as though the city itself had drawn in a long, reflective breath. The last of the investigation's dust had settled, and the newspapers, eager as ever to move on, turned their attention to fresher scandals. But for those of us who had witnessed the unraveling aboard the 542 from Calais, who had seen the veil of gentility torn to reveal something much darker underneath, closure did not come so easily. Poirot and I sat in a modest tea-room off Tavistock Square, the windows fogged by the drizzle outside. He stirred his tisane with the delicacy of a man conducting a symphony, but I could see that something weighed heavily on his thoughts. "They will forget her, won't they?" I asked, unable to keep the bitterness from my voice. Miss Hartwell, a quiet woman who tried to bring the truth to light. In the end, all she got was silence. Poirot didn't answer immediately. His eyes had wandered to the window, where the blurred outline of a passerby in a wide-brimmed hat reminded me, uncannily, of the woman we had buried just 2 days prior. "No, Hastings," he said at last. "She will not be forgotten, because the truth, it lingers. Even when it is buried, it breathes. It waits, and when it finally emerges, it sings." He folded his napkin and placed it precisely to the side. She was not a crusader, not a martyr, but she was brave in the way that matters most. She dared to speak, to investigate not for revenge, but for healing. That is the greatest kind of courage. I thought of young Timothy Ashford, now in correspondence with the family he never knew, of Lord Pembroke, slowly coming to terms with a title built on a stranger's legacy, and of others unseen, unnamed, who would one day open sealed letters, dust off locket chains, and rediscover the map of their own origins. Outside, a street musician began to play a mournful tune on the violin. A few notes into the melody, Poirot looked up. "The mockingbird, Hastings. Do you hear it?" I listened carefully. It wasn't birdsong, of course. Not literally. But there was something in the rhythm of the notes, the ache in the chords, the flickering rise and fall, that felt like a song being sung long after the singer had gone. It was sorrow, and truth, and hope. "She did not die in vain," Poirot whispered, "because now the silence has been broken, and that, mon ami, is justice in its purest form." As we stepped out into the London fog, the wind picked up, scattering brittle autumn leaves across the cobblestones like forgotten names finally given flight. I looked back once, at the tea-room, at the street corner, at the fading light, and felt something shift in me. Not closure, perhaps, but something close to it, because I understood then what Poirot had meant all along. The mockingbird's final song had not been one of despair. It had been one of truth, and truth, once sung, never truly fades. It echoes, and somewhere, someone always hears it, even in the quiet, even in the dark, even now.